Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Propagandacast State of the Balance with me, your host, Imperial Dane, here covering July 2016. Ooh, spooky. Certainly a lot has been happening here. We sort of have a full month now, roughly, with the new patch. And, well, more or less my predictions rather came true. Allies, in particular Americans and Soviets, dominant. Germans, less so. But let's have a look at the specifics here. Starting with the Americans, who've been having some unprecedentedly high win rates compared to, say, the Axis for the last few weeks. So this week has slightly dropped off, but pretty much the Americans, for the last few weeks, have been elite, which they've pretty much been for so much now. I think in terms of win rates there, in 1 versus 1s amongst the top players, which I think is rather the best place to look at it. And obviously, I mean, one of the sort of obvious reasons, of course, has been, this whole issue with the combined arms, which basically meant there was, like, ridiculously good, broken, in fact. But even then, there's still also the American mortar, which, still overperforms. I mean, it's like the best mortar in game, and it's available right away for the Americans. That definitely throws things off. But even had they brought in something with a similar stats to the 60mm mortar in the balance preview, it would probably still been a problem, since it would still been a mortar in the early game, though giving the Americans quite a few advantages. I mean, again, there's the whole issue with the strategic diversity. The Americans already had a lot, now they have even more. That sort of made things slightly skewed there in their favour. I mean, in terms of meta game, what they're currently going for is pretty much, I mean, there's some more lieutenant play thanks to the 50 caliber. The problem is, it's very rapidly dropped off because you're better off going for the Steward. In that sense, the Steward here is basically the problem. It's too good. I mean, it's a light tank, one of the most heavily armoured light tanks with the most health, self-repair, good anti-infantry, good anti-tank, and the ability to stun. It's a package that can do way too much for a price that is awfully, not very high. I mean, you can get a Steward light tank before T-70 light tank, and the T-70 is bad enough. The Steward is essentially much worse. And that's basically the problem. I mean, it simply put can do too much for a rather low price. And that rather needs to be looked into. I mean, they need to nerf the Steward. It's just too good. It's warping the rest of it. The problem is basically the Steward got buffed quite a bit before they sort of switched about the American tiers, basically the lieutenant and the captain on the same tier. Before, the Steward was, a bit later in the game, so they buffed it for more health. Problem is, it doesn't need that now, yet it still has it. So, essentially, at the very least, the Steward should get a nerf in health. And I'd probably also look into, removing the stun ability, or at least changing it a bit, to put it mildly, to be more something like the Stu G, which can't stun a tank either, or any vehicle. Now it just sort of locks down the weapons, because otherwise the Stu is just flat out too good, and really, really difficult to counter because of the self-repair, which means even if you do damage, it's still pretty survivable, and it has very little downtime before it gets back in the action. I mean, you'll see some players going for the Lieutenant and all that, but most won't, because they don't need to. There's no real advantage, they can get there that the Steward, can't do better. And that's a bit of a problem, really, so that kind of needs to be looked into. So, I mean, overall, I'd probably say Steward mortar for the time being, and also remove some of the received accuracy bonuses Riflemen get. I mean, at Veteran 3, they get like 42 or something like percent that, which means they essentially get what amounts to light cover bonus while out in the open. That's not good at all, so they need to look into that, since that pretty much only encourages blobbing. I mean, replace it with something else, maybe, cheaper smoke grenades or something like that, just, not light cover while not in cover. I mean, it just, doesn't encourage cover usage at all. That's bad, so that needs to be, toned down a bit. But otherwise, again, very much sort of captain play. Heavy cavalry still popular. Tactical support, very popular. Airborne, not so much. But yeah, it's pretty much just centered currently around heavy cavalry, armor, and tactical support. Those are pretty much sort of the three dominant doctrines at the moment. And again, the sort of current meta game really plays into it again with the sort of quick Steward and all that. So that needs to be looked into as well. I'm not so sure if there should be anything changed to the doctrines. But again, I mean, they are sort of three very potent doctrines. Hard to sort of change up that, but, if you sort of change up perhaps the omnipotence of the Steward, who knows, there might also be some other slight changes there. But beyond that, not so much as we'll say on the Americans, but again, they're like three things sort of really distorting, and again, Steward, I think, is sort of prime amongst them. Moving on to the British. The British are, well, not quite as dominant. They're still strong, but they're not quite as bad. Though the British bases suffer the same issue, except they can get that light cover bonus at all times, except they don't sort of get the bonus rate of fire at veterancy too. That also needs to be looked into. Sorry, but it does. Beyond that, not much to say about the British. They will sort of have some variety, though it's still very much mobile assault, advanced cover, a bit of tactical sort of, well, yeah, special weapon regiment with anti-tank hunters all there, crocodiles, commando, advanced, well, vanguard, I mean, sort of seeing a bit of usage there, and, a bit here as well, Royal Engineers, and then Red Wings uses Royal Artillery, sort of basically how it goes. Universal Carrier Fuel is a bit too dominant. They might have just made it a bit too much like a light tank in the early game. Might want to tone down the armor just a bit. Not a lot, just a bit more than what it currently is, since it does encourage some, slightly counterintuitive tactics for the British, which I think is a bit much. Beyond that, not much to say there about the British. Sort of in terms of, how they currently played or anything like that. I mean, I feel they're strong, but it's not quite, USA strong, which again is currently sort of like top tier Predator. And again, it's been so for months. So again, even if you sort of pin on the mortar, it's not quite going to be that. And again, also with the mortar, they could, afford a slightly weaker Steward. Moving on to the soldiers, again, I've certainly seen a resurgence. They'll be seeing a lot more penal troops now. For obviously, they've been buffed. They're pretty good. We'll be seeing a lot. So you generally expect some. I mean, still plenty will go conscripts, and still plenty will go heavy on Maxims, because the Maxim is still damn good. In fact, I had a longer discussion with a guy who's basically been spamming it, Sarek, who's like, I think, top 15, if not close to top 10. And, he pretty much says these things need to be nerfed. He's spamming Maxims to prove a point with it. The problem is basically it's too easy to maneuver about, too mobile, too good in suppression, too much damage for all it can do there. I mean, some will say, oh, it's hard to micromanage. The problem is you just need to attack move with it and it'll sort out any of that. That's basically a problem. One of the solutions I heard sort of talk to me about is generally just, rendering into sort of more generic machine gun. It's either that or just give it a large, fat, received accuracy nerf so it can't play around like so independently as it can, because that's a problem. They'll just sort of maneuver about there like an infantry squad with a really, really potent light machine gun, and that rather throws things off. So one is to either just make it more punishable, or overall tone down the Maxim to sort of more something regular, but then again not so potent. They could then, of course, then make it a lot cheaper, but at the same time then be sort of a lot more easy to outmaneuver and deal with, which is sort of the problem at the moment. It's not, and it's really, really easy to get out of a tricky situation, which is a bad thing. So if that would happen in either of those two, that would probably help a lot there. Otherwise, a lot more T-34s now they've been buffed. T-70s, of course, still very prevalent, but you do see more players now actually trying to skip them, but otherwise, a lot don't. In that regard, the T-70 could probably also do with some kind of nerf, probably somewhere in the direction of moving accuracy, since it's really good at sort of wiping units out there, and even standing still, it's pretty tough. Possibly also look into that repairability and just removing it. It just allows it to just soak up a third hit. And again, that sort of creates a bit the same as near Stewart dilemma. Allows it to soak up a lot more hits and get away with a bit more. So perhaps there, but otherwise, look into some of its accuracy. It's really good at wiping stuff. And again, it's very good at sort of containing the germs. So of course, there could be other solutions there, but it might be an option. Beyond that, so probably not so much else to look into. The Surge there, they overall feel pretty good now. But again, the T-70, I do feel like skews the entire thing. In fact, I've stopped using the T-70 when I play as a Surge myself, because it's just too damn good. I mean, get two T-70s, you can generally dominate the fight, in particular versus the Wehrmacht. They won't stand a chance. Which, as far as I'm concerned, pretty much means that thing is too bloody good. So I think that rather covers there with the Surge. In terms of metagame, again, Guardsman still very popular. Shock Rifle doesn't see so much action, but then when you can just Guardsman, penal troops, the other bits there, you don't really feel so much need for it. So it's pretty much all Guards Motor, a few Partisans and other bits. In fact, it might be time to look into Guards Motor and possibly nerfing it somehow, which will probably mean the Guardsman's armor, which will probably create a large cry, because it's either that or you begin buffing the Shock Troopers, and that one terrifies me. Because they're not bad either, they're just not Guardsmen. And of course, in that regard, you might argue the Guardsmen are just too good, which is rather the approach I'm probably thinking at. Because again, buffing the Shock Troopers appears to me like a very big no-no. It's not like no one ever uses it, but it's very much sort of Guards motor oriented. It's a very strong doctrine with a lot of potency, so something there needs to be looked into. And again, it sort of tends to focus around the guards riflemen and their mortars. Beyond that, you generally just don't see so many other doctrines. I feel there's a few here and there. Some go for the ones for the heavy machine guns like Lend-Lease, and of course that one does require mention as well. The M4C Sherman needs a building. It needs to stop being a call-in. It's just silly, really. It's a really strong medium tank you don't need to tech for. That's no good. That needs to be fixed. Moving on to the Germans, the Oberkommando West certainly is struggling a bit. They're under its new sort of auspices. A lot of players still desperately sticking to scavenge, like Jägers. Save us, Jägers. Save us. Hilf uns. Plenty of King Tiger play, Panther 4 play, some Panthers, Jagdpanzers, Battle Group Headquarters are all just there for the healing. I mean, most players will not, for example, bother with a flak half-track. Some will rely on light infantry guns. Infantry half-tracks don't see much usage. No surprise there, but really the flak half-track needs to be buffed. It needs to be, made more attractive. The problem is currently, if you go for the Battle Group Headquarters, you're leaving yourself very vulnerable to light vehicles, and even then, it almost costs the same as the looks. But that's just nowhere near the same comparable effectiveness, not even compared to other anti-aircraft half-tracks. This 251-17 completely falls behind. It needs to be, made more useful, both versus light vehicles, not just versus infantry. It needs, to be worth it, and that's currently not the case, so that needs to be sorted out. Otherwise, I'd still probably sort of over-recommend, changes to the Panthers, sort of how they work, sort of make them slightly more attractive, at least for the Oberkommando West. You don't have to tech to Tier 4. And of course, you got the King Tiger. It's, it's increasingly an awkward spot as they keep buffing allied tank destroyers, while at the same time not doing more for the King Tiger. At the current point here, probably just overall as a part of it, is just, A, switching about its veterans abilities, move Spearhead to Tier 1, that probably would help a bit there, and then remove Blitzkrieg and replace with something else entirely in terms of abilities, both for the Wehrmacht and the Oberkommando West, and instead make like a large Blitzkrieg ability that's part of the doctrine. I mean, that could be used to make elite armor a lot more useful if suddenly there was like a mass useful Blitzkrieg ability. Do that instead, Relic, please. And again, sort of make up some better abilities, maybe something, more, passive, maybe a bit like the Americans' RadioNet ability, just working in different ways. For example, but again, also talked about this, but for example, again, when they're like close to other units, like say infantry or specifically other kind of tank, they might suddenly gain a few other bonuses here, or they could impart bonuses then to other units near them. For example, the King Tiger might boost other units near it, where say a Panther 4 might get boosted by infantry, same with the Panther. Stuff like that, might overall be a lot more useful than Combat Blitz, which might as well be called the Italian Jitterbug, because it's all about getting away from the enemy, which seems a bit counterproductive for something called Blitzkrieg. So yeah, that sort of needs to be looked into. And Obersoldaten probably need a price reduction a bit there as well. I mean, for funded manpower, I think they're a bit too much on the high-end price there. Just make them slightly cheaper, like 340 manpower, something like that. They'll probably work out much better. But otherwise there, I mean, it's Luftwaffe, it's scavenge, it's fortifications, a lot more popular in particular versus British players who go heavy in emplacement due to the artillery. Firestorm, I'm seeing some usage of. I'm personally fond of that one thanks to Riku losses, which you can see me use in a recent episode. Also, Ostwind needs to require also building. In fact, overall, all armor call-ins I think should just require building, because otherwise you just get too many cheesy tactics. So just have that require a building to be used. Also, Ostwind needs a buff, particularly the Wehrmacht one. They're the same one, so basically they need to be buffed as well because they're not that good. So I think that rather covers it there for the Oberkommando. Then of course we come to the Wehrmacht, the sort of faction that's basically, for at least a year I think by now, sort of been left in the dust. I mean, basically, there's been this sort of massive power creep going on. Even the third sort of benefit from it, basically having been moved down to like 3 tiers, having things switched around. So basically their tier 2 has T-70s, S-106s, half-tracks. And then, of course, the Wehrmacht has nothing like that, for example. I mean, it just means the Wehrmacht has really been left behind. There's been all this work going on, and the Wehrmacht has benefited next to nothing. And you'll see it if you check the win rates. They've been consistently below the average win rate for, like, ages. And that should usually be an indicator. And they're really struggling. And overall, currently, you'll see most players throwing either to snipers, Pumas, or Stugis. And, of course, the Stugis should also, go to that spot there. I mean, it's generally mechanized assault, despite the assault gun it is still being pretty terrible. It's that or lightning roar. A few go for storm, a few still go for elite troops and so on there, but it's still very much focused around just a few doctrines there at the moment, which again is usually a bad sign. Also, we got a lot of players trying to play for Tier 4. The problem is Tier 4 most of the time still isn't very worth it. I mean, they make the Sturmpanzer better, and it does overall perform better. The problem is the Panther still isn't worth the resources, really, in most cases. I mean, there is no other faction at the moment that has a Tier 4, except the Wehrmacht. You don't have to research up to 4 tiers for any other faction. I mean, with the Americans, you get Captain Lieutenant, you get for the 3rd tier, the Company Command tier, or the Battalion, get your armor up. There you go. Brits again. 1, 2, 3. If you really want to be cheeky, 1, 2. And again, the same with the Soviets. I mean, the closest you have to focus on with the British is this one, which in resource cost approaches Tier 4, but even then, you still get a lot more before you even get to that. I mean, overall, their tiers are a lot more packed. So, in that sense, the Wehrmacht 4th tier has, close to a fourth of their units sort of packed away. And it's just too expensive to go for. I mean, you have a lot less options there, and the options there just don't quite act the same thing. I mean, you don't get, extra bombs or tracked vehicle, any sort of abilities ladder. You get extra infantry upgrades when you hit Tier 4 of Wehrmacht. So they need to look into that. They need to actually make Wehrmacht Tier 4 more worth it, and they need to, I think, reconsider all the Panther, both Oberkommand West and Wehrmacht. My personal suggestion is give it some AoE, a bit like the Comet. Just give it some AoE, or if they absolutely can't do that, increase the damage but lower the health. Maybe give it a bit of AoE that way as well, or increase the machine gun damage. So there's a bit of this and that, but overall, make the Panther a bit more worth it, because it's, in a pretty awkward place where it can only really work if your opponent at any time only has one medium tank. If you get more than one medium tank, the Panther's value drops massively, which is really strange, really. So that's something that needs to be looked into there for the Wehrmacht. Or again, they just need to be looked into. Their veterancy abilities, Blitzkrieg, for example, rubbish ability. And a lot of their Veterans Who Want stuff, again, it just doesn't add up. I mean, they're sort of supposed to be, all about the combined arms, but it just isn't there. So, again, like radionet abilities, that sort of work into it. Again, Panther 4 gets a boost with infantry by, maybe get more range, accuracy. Same with the Panther. Or something else, maybe suppression with machine guns, better AoE, more accuracy. Just something there. And for that matter, you can also just look at the Panzer 4. I mean, compared to, say, Sherman, which costs less, the Panzer 4 only has 20 armor more, but in pretty much every other department underperforms. It just can't do the same level of things. And Cromwell, also much cheaper than the Panzer 4 for the Wehrmacht, just also more or less performs better than it on many levels. I mean, in that sense, again, they need to figure out what the Wehrmacht shtick, its thing is, because currently it seems like they're not really sure what the Wehrmacht is supposed to do. At the very least, at this point, I'd probably just suggest, overall it's a flat-out thing, just give them like a range boost, like 5 range extra on, say, all their medium stuff. And then, of course, with the ability, they could up like 10 again. That would require still more reconnaissance, but then it also make more of the light vehicles more useful. I mean, there's something needs to happen. And again, if they wanted to be about combined arms, they need to add it in there more directly, because currently there's sort of, they don't have really a thing which, everybody else can't do better than them. That's basically the problem. They don't have anything sort of unique. In particular, again, when all of the other factions are overperforming, that really leaves the Wehrmacht in a very bad spot. So they need to figure out what they want there with the Wehrmacht, because it really feels like it's been the faction that's been sort of left drifting about there for the longest at the moment, and there's just no real answer coming from Relic. They just don't seem to acknowledge it. They just seem to either keep nerfing the Wehrmacht or buffing the Allies, but they never really seem to, overhaul the Wehrmacht and give them some kind of specific identity, because that's what they're lacking at the moment. They're just the Germans with supposedly overpowered stuff, but generally it doesn't work like that. I mean, for the most part, it's Stugis, Pumas, Tigers, or Tier 3 as the Wehrmacht. I mean, Panzer 4s and Stugs, because the Ostwind's terrible. So there's definitely a lot of work there needs to be done at, and again, overhauling the Veterans Who Want abilities for a lot of the units, in particular the tanks, I think is vital. Also buffing the 250 and half-track, gave its machine guns some light suppression, a bit like Company 1. I think that would help a lot there, and also give it a better Veterans Who Want ability rather than some curious reconnaissance stuff there. So yeah, bit of a longer sort of state of the balance, but in this case a lot more to be said, because the last patch has really just sort of upended things and really just shown all of the Wehrmacht's lackings, because really at the moment the Wehrmacht is really struggling, and again, the lack of sort of clear identity is becoming increasingly apparent against it. And the fact that it's been sort of neglected for, well, close to a year now, if not more, again, it becomes even more apparent. So whatever next patch Relic got planned really needs to take a hard look at the Wehrmacht and figure out where the hell they're supposed to go again. My suggestion, combined arms and a bit more range. In part because more range would also force the Americans to use some of all that bloody smoke they got. They got so much yet they don't have to use it. So force them, Relic. Force them. Please. So there you go. Again, a bit more passionate. And again, bunch of issues there, a lot to be worked on. But let's hope, Relic listens to this, or you make them listen to this, and something happens. This is Imperial Link signing off. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you gave some thoughts, some ideas, and if you did, subscribe, like, share, and so on. Of course, comment. And this is Imperial Link signing off, and see you all another time. Cheers.